authorities though.
Yeah.
Best that This.
Everyone can hear, right? Online that can hear. Okay. Alright. The Me Too movement, for example, was successful because of visceral cries of help of individuals who are suffering. Things like the Israel-Palestine conflict are very real, and we care about it because individuals are angry and we can see some real visceral impacts of these conflicts. What we want to do from opening government ultimately is we want to help individuals who need it most, and we want to do so through the best form of discourse altogether. But we would posit that the metric as to what discourse is good is which form of discourse gives the most empowerment to the individuals who need it most. Side of opposition is going to tell you that the side that can pass the policy the fastest or that can do this best is like the best form of discourse, but we would argue that the process in getting that policy is equally as important, if not more important than anything. What does our world look like? I want to just first make it clear that this is a norm of embracing anger, meaning that whatever happens across different themes of discussion, whether it be politics, sports, minorities, or whatever else closing government may want to talk about, it's important to note that the mechanisms in which you reach those outcomes will be whatever I explained to you in my speech and in Sanjee's speech. But secondly, with regards to this embracing anger, I think typically that looks like individuals just like, I don't know, just being angry. They're shouting, they're like, you know, maybe in the worst case scenarios like rioting on the streets and being angry. Note that's the worst case. But I think it's important to also be clear that people do not get mad if there's nothing to get mad about. So this debate has to be about very contentious issues where there are victims who are losing things that are very important, and I can give you the Pain Olympics of examples, but I don't think that's necessary. And I don't think opposition can be fair in fiating that people are not going to be angry in their world. Two arguments in my speech. Firstly, why on a principle level it is immoral for you to impose standards on individuals on how they should feel when they are facing pain. And secondly, why anger and objectivity is something that can coexist, but it can only coexist when you recognize and validate that anger. But first on this principle argumentation. So first thing, this concept of objectivity, I feel, is a term coined by the privileged individuals of society. These are people who do not know what it's like to suffer in a war, but are just saying that, oh, you know, don't be too emotional. Let's have a proper conversation about it. I think on a principle level, this is something that is immoral because you are in no position to impose your values and your way of life onto other individuals. And I think when you allow this and you validate this process through this like objectivity in the world of opposition, I think that is where it's incredibly like unfair onto victims of these suffering, because oftentimes these are individuals who, you know, obviously didn't choose when they were born, didn't choose to be victims. All these things are random and things that happen by chance, or even worse, or if they are victims of structural oppressions and, like, you know, because they're the minority race in that country, for example, meaning that the majority group of individuals is telling these people how you feel, and side of opposition further validates this. But secondly, I think it's important that these are issues often of very large scale, meaning that it's very difficult for you to solve this discussion, which is why opposition would argue that you cannot be angry about these things because we need to be objective, because like time sensitivity and whatnot. But I think it's also important that because these things are difficult to solve, just because you're more objective doesn't mean you immediately solve it in one day. I think it's important to note that you need to allow individuals to get some form of catharsis through that process. And I think through that process, when they are venting, when they are shouting, when they are screaming, I think these are times as to when individuals and victims actually get some form of catharsis and in telling individuals and validating their opinions and their feelings. So even if that policy doesn't get passed, at least they get to feel better on a personal level. But you know, leading up to the day that the policy is passed, at least they feel better in the process. How do they feel throughout their process? in their world. I think if opposition admits that these individuals can be angry in private, there is a concession that there is value in being angry. But I would argue that the public showing of anger is important because it rallies people together and it symbolizes to individuals that you are not alone as a victim and that your opinions are equally valid in this discourse. Opposition will tell everyone to stop crying and talk about it fairly. I think that is an incredibly unfair burden to put onto victims of circumstances. And I also want to explain and make it clear that this argument is non-consequential, meaning irrespective of what the discourse actually leads to, I think it's already a harm that these individuals cannot express themselves freely, and I need to make it clear that that is very important for these individuals. Before I proceed to the practical argument, yes.
After World War II, many German people denied the Holocaust ever happened because they want to hide behind the veil of ignorance. It's only when we have facts that 3% of the world's population died that we're able to break through this barrier.
Okay, so that actually leads me very nicely into this point, because the fact that you saying 3% of the population actually catches our attention is because we are in a privileged situation whereby we understand how statistics work and we understand how numbers work. If you're an individual who is uneducated, you didn't have the luxury of going to tertiary education, you stopped studying when you were 7 years old because you just didn't have the choice, the only language you really understand is pain and what it's like to lose people around you. I don't think it's enough for you to just say that these numbers are good and therefore people will understand. You need to analyze as to who are the people who will understand and who are the people who don't. And I think that's an important question they have to answer. So let me explain why anger and objectivity is actually something that can coexist. But this is something that must happen in phases. The first thing I want to say is that it is a step-by-step process. And I think if we dumb it down to the most micro level, like when you're talking to your friend, for example, it is oftentimes when they are going through something very difficult, you just ask them, do you want to vent out your issues? Or do you want to talk about this first? And usually you would vent out your emotions first before, it's already 6, before you actually go into a constructive discussion. And that's because it's important to get the emotions out of the way first before you actually have some form of objective discussion. In the world of opposition, they totally shut down that emotional channel altogether. So I think there are two possible cases on their side. The first is that these individuals who are angry do not enter discussions altogether, and maybe they just remain angry in private. Sanjii will talk a bit more about that in his speech. But secondly, I think you will have more forced discussions whereby you are forcing angry people to be dispassionate objectively. So what this looks like is that individuals are impatient, they're not willing to listen, and they project their anger onto other individuals. I think that is something that is very bad, and you do not get objectivity at all in their world. If anything, objectivity is better in our side, whereby you get that passion out of the way. But more importantly, I think passion is something that's infectious. It's a global language that can rally individuals together because it's something that's relatable. You need individuals to stop and consider the consequences of their action in order to actually reflect on any form of oppression. I think you do not get that pause in the world of opposition because you don't have something that is visceral. Very proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Hanafi invites the leader of opposition.
Okay, this good? Oh, this better? Alright, I'll do this. Couple things in opening opposition. Off the top, we agree with OG that this debate is about public discourse, which ought to be the best way to empower people who are the most vulnerable and who need a form of speech to empower them the best. We would argue in opening opposition, it is actually better that you engage in discussion in a dispassionate, objective way, in a calm and stoic manner, rather than expressing the politics of anger in all the ways the Prime Minister wants to talk about. There's one important piece of framing I want to posit at the top of the speech, is that emotion says support a norm of doing this, which means that the world that the government defends is not just a world where some people are angry, it's a world where majority of people are angry, majority of the time. And the same way we have norms of things like honesty is a good thing and we shame people for being dishonest in the status quo, is the same way that the government team or the world, the people in the world of government is likely to shame people who attempt to use facts and statistical data to argue things and instead push them towards using emotional rhetoric, because that's what the world is like likely to be. So it is a world where the predominant form of discourse is fiery and anger, and a world where people are pressured to engage in these kinds of discussion. It is unclear as to why this leads to positive outcomes. The second thing I want to frame is in terms of the kind of public discourse and who talks about this in the first. So we agree it's probably going to be like social issues, like activism, people in the BLM movement, people in the feminist movement that are fighting for social issues, engaging in political discussion and stuff like that. But we do not agree that it only comes from people who are privileged. We think that anyone can engage in public discourse, especially in the age of information today.
Clarification.
Public figures, later, podcast people, influencers, politicians, community leaders, etc. It is unclear as to why necessarily it is privileged people in our side of the house telling people to be quiet. I think it is everyone telling everyone to be calm, looking at facts and statistical data. Empirically, this is true as well. Most of the BLM leaders are black, right? I don't think we see like white leaders. There's a lot of white allies, but not necessarily white leaders. The same thing with the feminist movement. Majority of them are women because they have lived experiences and they actually care about those issues. And I think this is important as well because it's not as if in a world where we focus on calm discourse that we don't have any kind of change, where leaders don't have the motivation to do stuff. I think precisely because they became community leaders in the first place, that they formed a coalesced social movement, that they went around lobbying, asking for public awareness and funding, means that these are people who often have deep lived experiences. If they are women part of the feminist movement, if they're someone who shared their stories on the Me Too, for example, that deeply care about these issues and want to see things change. So even if they see, or even if they are seen to be more dispassionate outside the house, I think their passion and desire to see change is equally strong, if not stronger, on our side of the house as well, and they continue to going to push for this there. The last thing I want to talk about, and this is kind of a response to the OG, is in terms of anger and catharsis being a principal good. I think that's great, and we are happy to support the expressions of anger in private and outside the house. I think that's perfectly fine. It is unclear as to why this must be an expression in public. It is unclear what this leads to in terms of a positive outcome of moving things forward, and I'm going to show in constructive material why that's not going to be a good thing. So we're very happy for people to release their anger privately before engaging in this public dispassionate discussion. I think that's a better way to go about doing things. First argument, why do you think dispassionate objectivity is preferable when engaging in public discourse? There are three reasons. The first is that you need to be calm and dispassionate in order for you to truly capture the nuances and the specific lived experiences of the people in the movement, of the people in the discussions you want to talk about. So beyond the speeches and discussion, it also extends to the documentation of these things, of stories through video, in policy briefs, in surveys, in articles, etc. We think that a world where you tend to focus on very strong passion, very strong anger, means you often default to the more extreme, the more radical versions of what is happening, and you often miss out the moderate stories, but through the nuances and subtle nuances within those stories. So I think it looks like the difference between the privileged woman and the less privileged woman within the feminist movement. I think it's looking at cultural feminism and different forms of feminism, of like cupcake feminism, for example, or women that want to stay at home and take care of kids because they find that to be empowering. These are the kind of nuances that are likely to be lost out in a world where we shame all men to be terrible and the patriarchy to be absolutely horrible, but you do not engage in those particular discussions. And the reason this is important is one, you need to have these stories included in your advocacy, in your targeted messaging for you to have solutions that specifically look at them. But number two, you need to include them as an intersectional movement and understand their stories and how you can address policies, how you can support messaging, norms and narratives that support these members of the movement uniquely. The second reason as to why dispassionate objectivity is better is because you're more likely to engage people on the other side. We will argue that people are more willing to have a discussion with reasoned arguments rather than with someone who is shouting at you, calling you homophobic, calling you a terrible patriarchist or something like that. And I want to flag here that on our side of the house, it's not like we're going to convince every single person in the world. I think hardcore conservatives are not going to change on either side of the house. The delta in this debate has to be, one, the more moderate community and political leaders who are more willing to listen to you when you approach things and make a more reasoned argument as to why we should create more battered women's shelters, we should expand tax funding to build schools in rural areas, for example, as opposed to shouting at them saying that they're privileged elitist person. But second, I would argue that most of these community leaders are often rational, and because they have many different priorities, may not necessarily have the information that they need to make decisions in terms of what is out there. So presenting them with well-reasoned arguments, with facts and data, is more effective at convincing them than the counterfactual. The last thing I want to explain to why this is better is because it helps support the longevity of the movement and the causes you're fighting for. We will argue the politics of anger tend to sure, I'll take that first.
How much is objective it can be? Because technically, Camela can punch me once and say that it's self-defense, whereas I can punch her multiple times or verbally abuse her. Obviously, the harms of physical harm is much more worse than verbal.
Yeah, so I think facts don't really discriminate, right? So you can have different interpretation of those facts, and even in debates, we still agree on certain baselines about what debate should be about, but the way we interpret that is where that discussion has to happen. But I think it's only in our world when you have that discussion in the first place. In your world, you're just shouting that you are right, you're not necessarily engaging with the alternative. Let's just wrap this up quickly in terms of longevity. We argue that the politics of anger tend to revolve around charismatic leaders who have the ability to shout very loudly. So people like Trump and people like MLK, for example, we noticed that the civil rights movement tend to drop off a bit after he got shot because he was no longer able to sustain that level of anger and passion in the public sphere. The alternative is, on our side, is looking at causes, facts, and reason, is more likely to be able to be carried on in the future and to engage those things longer periods of time so that those causes are brought forward. How do you weigh this? 3 ways. 1, discussions are better when they are likely to be civil and conservative, and constructive. When people are more willing to come to the table, stay at the table to talk about things that happen, potentially admit that they are wrong, and come to constructive outcome. The alternative is that if egos get bruised, when leaders make strong statements that they have to back up in order to retain their support, you're not likely to lead to constructive outcome in your world. Second is when discussions are carried through to a meaningful conclusion in terms of progressive change, in terms of conflict resolution, etc. Passion is very high energy, so when those things die out, you may not necessarily get an outcome, and when the change or the future evolves, you may not necessarily have the capital to continue having change in the future. Lastly, just where people are happier, because antagonism is minimized, you have a more collaborative approach and you don't call people names. Everyone is just much better off in this world. Proud of this.
Thank you. Like we begin.
I think it's correct that we do need to have conversations where we're able to talk about nuances of whatever problem we're talking about. The problem here is a world where we don't embrace anger, is a world where you don't let people talk about it. TJ says they can listen to podcasts, but if the victim who wants to talk about her Me Too story cannot be angry about her story, it makes it harder for them to talk about it. It makes it harder for them to want to listen to those podcasts, because the moment they are angry is also the moment opposition will say, you are being too passionate, we don't care about what you say. The issue here is objectivity is a weapon used by individuals who are able to understand or weaponize it. More often than not, it is inaccessible for the average population to understand what objectivity is. Objectivity does not mean we have a certain truth A. Objectivity just means in analyzing certain truth A, we use certain structures or like certain ways to analyze it. What this means is that it is oftentimes can be wrong. If it is not wrong, we won't have a debate. That's the point. We need to get people to argue about things. We need to get people to talk about it. We need to get people to understand that just because you are objective, it doesn't mean you are correct. And the way in which we get people to be part of that discussion is by being able to allow them to access those emotions. Aiman said passion is infectious, but it's also more than that. Passion is what keeps people going. And if you allow them to express that passion, it is why we have debaters that have been debating for 10 years. Because objectively, we know debate is pretty good. But if you don't allow them to access that passion, at some point, they just feel like they're not being heard to. At some point, they feel no matter how objective they are, no one is going to care about them. The Zionists will still think that they're objectively correct, and they will tell the Palestinians to just stop crying, stop being a baby, be objective about it. And that's what's going to happen in the world of opposition. We need to use anger because it is a universal language that any individual can learn. And here's where I go into one of my main crux of responses, is that objectivity as a metric, it is something that's more often than not inaccessible. You need to be a highly intelligent person to be able to analyze what you are talking about and what the other person is saying, what is the clash in that world. And you need every single person to do this. In our world, we can have like a spokesperson that is objective, but the vast proportion of the society uses anger to keep that going. And that's what we are arguing for. Because as Aiman's speech already, we didn't say we disagree with the use of dispassionate objectivity. We disagree with the use of telling people to be angry to calm down. We disagree that you cannot be angry when you have discussions. We say you need to be.
That's the impetus for change. That's the catalyst for why people pay attention to the podcast that DJ wants to talk about. Because they can relate to it. You can't relate to objective metrics if you don't understand it. But it's very easy to understand pain. It's very easy to understand loss. And that is what the side of opening government is trying to argue for. No thank you. The other thing that DJ says is that we rather use data as a way to have discussions. The problem here is data doesn't talk. Yes, facts don't discriminate, but facts also don't mean anything if you cannot interpret it properly. You want interpretation to exist in an objective method, but how many people are actually going to interpret that in that way? If it's inaccessible, like what I said earlier, your data is not going to be used by the people that need it the most. If you are angry and you use data in a way to prove your anger, that is something that only exists in the world of government. Because you know that this is the basis for my anger, I have data to back it up. And you allow people to use that to keep it going. You convince more people to listen. Yes, maybe that leads to antagonization, but we believe antagonization existing in the public sphere is better than it existing in a private one. And this is where I go into my argument. Before that, I'll take one from closing if you have.
Yeah, passion to keep going is not something we particularly have us to defend, because we have to be trying to be dispassionate. You need to defend the word people going heads on with anger in forms of expression.
Okay, cool. I'll go into my arguments straight away then. Why do I think that the underground manifestation of anger is going to be worse than a world where people are actively antagonizing each other in public? Like 3 things I'll talk about here. The first is about the idea of galvanizing individuals in a way in which you can challenge them. In the world of opposition, you be angry in an underground private sphere. So firstly, that means you talk to lesser people about it. But number 2, you only talk about it to people who will agree with you. So no one's going to call you out about it. You use your anger and you express it there. They just feed into your anger and tell you you're correct. And you lead to a world where people are stuck not only in echo chambers, but they're stuck in echo chambers where they don't even have the ability to have anyone else to pop it. Because you don't allow them to express it in public. If you are angry, but you know you cannot be dispassionately objective, you're not going to be part of the public discourse. And that's something that the burden that the opposition team needs to push for. Because while it's true that we want everyone to be angry, we think that's good. Anger is what keeps you going. Our emotions are indicators of the things in which that we think about. We argue that it's better for you to feel it first and think about it later, rather than to think about it first and to feed it later. And the reason why this is the case is because emotions are your thermometer to decide what's important to you. The reason why you feel angry is because even though you don't know it now, is because it affects you in such a personal level that you use your intellect and thinking about it to then be able to galvanize and convince other people why this is important. In your world, you shut down the use of emotion in order to be part of this process. Number 2, I think that when you have closed forms of manifestations of anger, it's also when you have things like extremism. Because no one is going to talk to you about it, no one's going to challenge your views. Your views just get propagated with people that agree with you, and then you collectivize in a way that's underground, no one challenges it. Eventually at one point you have riots that are not just 2 people challenging each other, it's riots where individuals feel like their anger was never heard in the first place, they rather resort to violence. That is something that we want to avoid. In their world, you shut down people from accessing catharsis because there is a value in just being angry and letting people hear your anger. It does not matter if people don't agree with you. We want you to have the space to do so. Because if you don't have that space in a public sphere where individuals can agree or disagree, they can give you feedback and criticism, it's a world in which you only manifest those angers in an underground environment where there is no control or check and balance or any form of accountability. And we think that's worse for public discourse. They want cooperation, but they don't prove how these individuals who are angry are going to get those cooperations in their world. In our world, it's where in which you talk about it. It's when you have counter riots, for example. It's unlikely for that to happen because they will say they're angry, that's not discourse, that's not how the world should work. You need to have individuals who are extremely polished, who are extremely educated, who are have high intellect to be able to be your spokesperson. Those are barriers to entry to discourse that we don't want to occur. Because the moment in which you shut people out of discourse is also the moment in which the quality of your discourse is no longer representative. So no matter what policy changes that they make quickly, it's not going to benefit the large portion of the population that need those policies. Because those individuals are locked out from that discussion. And that's why it's really important. But thirdly, in our world, we think it's good that anyone can be a leader. We think it's good that anyone can use the universal language of pain and anger to appeal to the largest portion of the population. Because if they can view themselves in their leader, that's when they keep the fight going. We beg to propose.
Thank you. It might be the clean up.
Test. I just checked that there are no VIPs here. I think I might accidentally swear. No, quick shout out, 20 seconds, TJ, for carrying me, coming off retirement. Haven't debated in 7 years for me. Hauling my ass through semi-finals. I don't know what I'm doing here. But yeah, thanks TJ. Thanks everyone. Fun round, let's have fun. Feeling very nervous because I've not done this in a while and I've not made finals in a while. Fact, OO has won most majors, most worlds. I don't know, I just thought it was fun. Probably not. The first thing I'm going to get clear in this speech is that Haikal POIs that data, and the OG contention is also that data is not objective. But yes, so we'll have data from official third-party sources, things like the UN, things like the World Bank, things like third-party independent organizations. So people can't politicize these things because the people who collect the data and do the survey are neutral. But even if it's not objective and is quote-unquote not accessible, this debate must be assessed on a comparative. That is to say, objectivity is definitely better than subjectivity because under your side, the Me Too movement requires people, incels, to put themselves in the shoes of a woman who went out alone at night with a man. Who put themselves in the shoes of the victim. And a lot of people can't do that, right? A lot of people can't pierce the veil of ignorance. As I POI, and that was important, people like to hide behind the fact that, hey, we are not horrible people. White people don't like to think of themselves as colonizers. Some Germans still deny the Holocaust. Lots of Jewish people still say there's anti-Zionism in the world. These are convenient reasons they can hide behind when not confronted with data. So they lose the comparative from that. Secondly, when Martin Luther King pioneered black rights, he stepped away from violence and radicalism. He didn't lean into the anger much like the Black Panther did. If you check this empirically, you will know that our way is the way to move forward in the world. So did Gandhi. He didn't use violence. He didn't resort to any radical things. And he still got what he wanted. Shit, my time is stopped. But thirdly, I think it's important to note in this debate that Gov never mapped what anger looked like. And here's why they didn't want to map it. Because, thank you very much, anger looks like rallying people around strong words and strong rhetoric. Things we say in LO, like calling people a homophobe, calling them a racist, a xenophobe. These are rallying points for people simply because it's very easy for me to get behind anger. It's very easy to shit on someone in power, to deflect blame and accountability for myself. So the Gov never wanted to make this simply because they have to attack people when they're angry. They have to defend mudslinging under their side of the house. I want to talk about two issues in this speech. One, why data will be much better than feelings, and two, why anger is bad. One, why we think data is the better way to confront people and change their minds. The first thing, as I alluded to earlier, was that it's often sourced from academics and people who do not have a vested interest. Sure, maybe the academic is white, but they're also minority academics. Academics also don't have the same incentive to politicize social movements the same way politicians do, or people from the social movements have themselves. They'll say it's less likely for mudslinging to happen, it's less likely that people find dirt on them, it's less likely that they collect the data in a flawed way, simply because they have a reputation to uphold as a professor of a university. Secondly, we think it's also easy to persuade someone with data when, because it's neutral. Words and rhetoric are not neutral, right? Under their side, they will have to defend calling people who support abortion baby killers instead of giving facts that maybe, lots of pregnancies in this state are from teen mothers, right? The data is easier to break through this shell because you force people to forcibly align themselves with the phrase baby killers. People don't want to do that. The third reason we gave you was that we stand the test of time better. Data doesn't change, right? The fact that the earth was round and now it's flat and now we all agree that it's flat for the rest of time. The problem with rhetoric is that it dies out. People like Martin Luther King die out. People like Nelson Mandela, whether you think it's good or not, people like Gandhi die out. They are dependent on the charisma of individual leaders, whereas we stand the better test of time. It's harder for leaders to reverse policies when it's based on cold hard fact instead of rhetoric. I want to weigh this against opening government. Maybe it's true that people still are angry and they go underground, but at the point in which, as I'll prove later, you get better policies outside of the house, this underground movement will have less traction. So maybe there's the capacity to be angry, but more people will be willing to engage in a public atmosphere where the discourse is civil, where they feel as if they are being heard instead of being shut out. We win uncertainty because we don't anger people in power. Weigh this against opening government. They say, oh, but they need to feel catharsis because I've gone through something. Again, The point is, being angry burns connections with other people, but even if people want to support your movement, nobody wants to support a movement that is loud and demonizes people and calls them baby killers or hardcore conservatives, right? No one wants to feel personally attacked. Secondly, why is anger bad? And I just want to frame here, right? Anger is symmetric. Passion is symmetric. The delta in this debate is the way we express these feelings. We gave you reason that a lot of people are still passionate. If not, they won't be heading the movement. Anger is still symmetric. People will still feel like shit. It's just that they don't aggressively act out on it, right? So people are probably able to understand this. The first reason why anger is bad is because it creates a race to the bottom. At the point in which you encourage and support the norm of personal insults and mudslinging is also the point in which it proliferates. And there's a very simple structural reason for that. Given OG's own premise of anger being a universal rallying point, that means social movements who use it are able to garner a lot more social support than social movements who don't. This creates a race to the bottom where more people want to personally insult each other, more people are willing to mudsling other movements and create more extremism. The second thing we said is that it crowds out discourse. Think about it and gut check this. Every time someone talks about Trump saying grab a woman by her genitals, it's also less airtime and discussion on his actual immigration policies for immigrants in the United States of America. And this is visceral because people don't remember the actual words, but they remember the feeling. And you know this, I can't remember how certain people make me feel because said to me, but I know how they make me feel. No thank you, I'll let Haikal in a bit. Lastly, you activate the self-defense mechanism. When you are angry, when you shit on people in power and call them homophobe, you activate their self-defense mechanism. They are less likely to concede to you at the point in which they feel they are being personally attacked and their reputation is online. Yeah, Haikal.
You stole my case from Sanjii like yesterday. That's a fact. My anger is my emotion. The problem here is that no one knows that I'm angry at you because I have to believe that you just stole it for the sake of winning this round.
No, but okay, that's like again, that's subjective. Objectively, we look at data and baseline things, big issues like police brutality or maybe gay rights. Like these are baseline figures we can probably rally around. Maybe we lose some small stories on the ground, but in terms of large-scale change, in order to get the support of a majority of people, you need to definitely pander to them with data. The last thing I want to say is that government cannot control how people get angry and how some people do this. If some people get angry and resort to extremism and radicalism, it backfires and destroys the movement for the rest of time. And gut check this, it takes one immigrant who messes up, one black person to commit a crime, and people latch on this narrative and say all of them are like that, all of them have mental issues, all of them are school shooters, right? At the point in which we have a civil discussion, this is less likely to happen. They can control how people express their anger. Very proud to oppose. I don't know what the time is. Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite the member of government.
Let's go, Haikal.
Is this ready? The norm of aspiring to dispassionate objectivity originated from the privileged majority. But make no mistake, it is not for the sake of clarity of discussion, but rather a tool for suppression for change. The reality is, a lot of the majority and also the privileged people are the only ones who have the ability to actually tell the people on the ground that you should actually use a more sophisticated language. You should be calm in your discussion. You should try to produce facts. And the reason is very simple, because a lot of times, the anger that exists within yourself is one that is very irrational to a point where you're no longer able to control yourself. Or the fact that the facts that exist is very hard for you to produce. A minority or the women in age of like 1940s are not able to access research and academia in order for them to prove their and justify their cause because of the fact that all of them are not privileged enough to be able to access all of this. This is why all the majority and also the privileged people are continuously telling us that we should stop this. Sure, maybe O is right that the case coming from OG about benda boleh gaduh buat apa bincang might lose this debate, but it doesn't engage with the reality of this debate then. What exactly then our case is going to be? The reality is that this debate is not only limited to the social media and discussion, but focusing and heavily involve the politicians and the public figures who rely on the emotional rhetoric for them being able to actually speak up about it. Our case is going to be very simple. It's going to be an attack towards your credibility, which ensures that you have no ability to platform your discussion, which is why it's very, very harmful. Because I want to point out, the irony coming from opening opposition is that, yeah, sure, maybe they say that we need to have both. The question then becomes, how exactly are you going to have both? Because the reality is that the discussion dynamic is very imbalanced. It is always the rich and the privileged are the ones who have the way to actually control the discussion. Which is why whenever Trump used very vulgar language and also very aggressive tone, not one actually bat an eye and say anything about it. But when Kamala Harris decided to use any form of language, they are going to call him the terrorist. They are the one who are actually criminal. They are the one who are being associated to the black people. The reason is because the discussion always centered and being controlled by the majority and the privileged, which is why you have no ability to control. What then does this become? First extension. The reality is that we need to actually have embracing the anger in the public discourse because we know that it is a way for us to counterbalance the mechanism for discussion. Because if it is true that the privileged are the one who can use anger and also use facts, why exactly the minority are limited to only using facts? The question that we need to ask, why exactly the norm of dispassionate objectivity actively dominate the ability for the minorities to be able to speak out? Three simple reasons. The first is because of the imposition by the privileged. The reality is that the privileged are the one who controls the discussion. They can simply use the media and say that, well, this person is so uncredible because they keep using the language but not focusing on the discussion. It's so easy for them to be able to say that because they have a lot of evidence to show that they are the one who are actually using a very calm language and sophisticated. Secondly, is the inherent human nature to be actually curious towards the objective truth. Or cannot simply say that all the minorities do not want to provide any truth or evidence or facts. They would if they could, and they actively try to do that because that's why we see a lot of feminist movement are actively producing information and economists research to show that the women can actually contribute to the economy, which means we already actively try to produce the information in order for us to actually engage with the objective truth as well. Thirdly, is the active perception that the anger is actually uncivilized. Take a look at the language that OO used. Well, if you are angry, then you are civilized, you are irrational. Why? Just because Camila is using a very anger language because I just punched her or verbally abused her, it does not mean that she's uncivilized. It's her emotion to show that what I did has so significant amount of impact towards her, which is why it is very, very harmful. All of these things prove to you why exactly dispassionate objectivity actively dominate. The question then becomes, in order for us to balance and ensure that both things are able to exist, we need to make sure that we have this norm, because this is the only norm that allows us to be able to argue that the minority can also embrace this anger. If the majority are going to embrace the anger, we should allow to do the same thing. This is important because if opening house says that we need both, it's only in CG we explain to you why exactly you are able to access this, because you create more acceptance towards anger when you say that your anger is actually validified. Why exactly then this is very important? Because what that shows to you, it allows us to actually have more meaningful discussion, because one type of information and evidence is insufficient to paint the full picture. We need to know the significant impact of it. If not, we are not able to actually be able to paint the full picture, which is why it is necessary for us to have the counterbalance. This map as to why exactly we get both things, which is why it's better. Second extension then, I'll take you in a bit. Why exactly then objective truth actively remove the ability for you to be able to discuss, and the reason is because it reduces you to stats and number. I want to first point out too, how exactly do we define objectivity? Because I feel like it's very hard for us to understand what exactly objectivity, right? In a lot of situations, people just opt into believing that stats, evidence, and facts are what we consider objectivity. Here's the problem, right? If it is true that it's about facts and numbers, two problems. One, numbers can actually be exploited heavily. Take a look at an example of what type of policy that we use in order for us to combat the crime rates within America. A lot of people associate black people as the criminal, which is why they think that if we increase the amount of police in their area, we know that it can reduce the amount of crime within the area. Which is true, the number just goes down. But guess what? We forgot that the reason why the number goes down, because the black Americans are actively being killed every single day, which is why the number keeps going down, because no one dares to actually commit any form of even go out from their house because they're scared of the police. On that order, they remove the ability for us to discuss what exactly the cause as to why exactly the black Americans are actually becoming criminal. It's probably because the lack of development within the area. It's probably because of the oppression and discrimination that exists within the area. It's probably because of the lack of opportunity. But no one knows about all of these things because no one dares to talk about it at the point where you only want to have evidence and information, but this one is limited to only the privileged in nature. But secondly, the lack of information means that it's very, very hard for you to be able to talk about it, which is why it's very, very hard. The comparative here is simple. We ensure that we're able to complete the story and it's far better. Before I move on to my extension, sure.
One, discourse is not to the privileged. Anyone can start a podcast and be proved. But even if that was the case, families have used academic data to show the economic value of diversity quotas. Given activists have good incentives on our side of the house, why wouldn't they use the data well?
Correct, but that only applies to the Western undeveloped countries. Have you ever seen any Malay feminist movement who decided to actually publish a discourse or publish a paper about how exactly the Malay women in Malaysia are able to contribute to the economy? No, because it's only limited to our countries or only limited to the privileged who has the information to do this in the first place. But final extension, why exactly it suppressed the minority? I want to first point out is that in a lot of situations, we attack the character of these individuals because they are associated with this specific angle, which means that instead of listening to what they're saying, even when they're producing facts, we only attack them because of the fact that that is a woman and therefore they are irrational. Therefore, we should not listen to the things they're saying. Or there is a black person, they're going to be angry, which means that it's unlikely for us to listen to the things. You can simply attack their credibility by saying all of those things which harm the ability for them to create changes in the first place. But secondly, the identity associated with them are also being harmed because that means that every single time a black person wanted to discuss about their thing, they're already being attacked and being undermined in the first place. All of these things goes to you as to why exactly the ability for the minority to access discussion is far limited. If discussion is necessary, it's only in CG where we're able to access it.
This debate takes place beyond a value judgment of whether it is better for minorities to be angry or whether you should go and aspire to be objective. 4 nuances that CG will bring about today's debate. Number 1, how other stakeholders are likely to react to your anger. Secondarily, how anger is an increasing hedonistic treadmill in which each instances of an adrenaline release of anger now perpetuates the norm of anger to be one that is exacerbates. Thirdly, of how this then, the norm of increasing anger, leads to the increased desensitization of this particular anger. Fourthly, this means that barriers of participation of that anger now creates these forms of barriers and deters people from participating in this discourse meaningfully to begin with. I want to note here that this is the deadlock that all of these 3 houses have caught themselves into, and CG is the only one that gives you the nuance. But first, I want to respond briefly to CG here, even though they are large derivative, right? CG tells you that at the end of the day, minorities must express their anger publicly because it's their only platform to do so, and it's a way of telling fuck you to the elites, right? Here are 4 reasons why is that at the end of the day, this is going to be further weaponized by the elites, and minorities have no particular access to reach that form of catharsis that CG wants. Number 1, the reason why minorities cannot use anger publicly is that you will always at the end of the day be painted as the aggressor and as the hostile actor by these particular elites, by these politicians. Secondarily, the reasons why minorities feel so much anger to begin with is because there exists a power gap between the state and the minorities. The reason why there's a power gap is because the state has failed to give these minorities infrastructures and policies to necessitate their livelihoods. To use anger to fill in the power gap does not bring you tangible policies, does not allow you to incentivize the state to give you these kinds of policies. It it does not do any of these things. Rather, it's largely to lead to number 3. The majority likely is to use that form of anger to weaponize it against you. This looks like in current status quo. Politicians using their own particular anger to weaponize emotional rhetoric, such as Trump rallying people against the immigrants to tell them we should build a wall, using people's anger sentiments against these minorities. This is likely to be true because insofar as we buy into the Gulf bench framing that the elite has the most political capital and social capital, this weaponization is likely to be harming towards the minorities. And fourthly, this means that minority will always lose out in the face of expressing their anger in public. But next, moving on to just a slide setup, because we think that OO here only tells you of what anger really looks like, or what dispassionate looks like, which largely is on the metric of data and things like that, but we don't think that's particularly true. 3 reasons why people engage in public discourse. Number 1, to convey their ideas to other people. This looks like conveying their values, conveying their facts. This is most usually under the parameters of social movements. Secondarily, to find objective truth, to discover something through discussions. Note that this is an exclusive impact that can only get on the site CG here, because when you aspire to be dispassionate objectivity, this means the mental calculus of you here, you don't go straight hand in with the idea of wanting to be aggressive. Rather, you aspire to try to at least understand different perspectives that are different from yours. Thirdly is also individual expression. This looks like wanting to be heard, wanting to be validated. Note that being angry does not give you the exclusive form of validation here. I've already proven that just now. This is all important here for number 2 things, the metrics of why CG win this debate, because number 1, we provide you meaningful forms of engagement, and number 2, the meaningful forms of participation as well. Where does public discourse actually take place? We think it takes place largely partly on 3 things. Number 1, politics, religion, and also social movements. All of these things shows that a large chunk of anger when it takes place on these contentious public discourse necessarily mean that anger is more than not heightened, because all of these 3 things are extremely sensitive and are extremely related to a person's individual values that necessarily have competing interests with lots of people that they want to talk to. Why is our counterfactual better? We think we have 4 reasons here. The counterfactual is largely look like. I want to also note here that this is going to be a more illustrious counterfactual compared to what the opening gave you here. The counterfactual looks like number 1, a more emphasis on the truth of facts. I want to note here the delta here is the mental calculus of how people enter into public discourse, the point in which you aspire to achieve dispassionate objectivity. First, the emphasis on truth and facts looks like you don't require any form of vocal enhancements of emotional rhetoric when it comes to conveying your particular truth. This also looks like within politics in itself, and within politics itself, you no longer use anger as a form to rally people up. Rather, you use things like just convey and tell people that, hey, the climate change, the earth is dying and things like that, as opposed to telling people all of you are pigs, you should all, pick up your trash and things like that. Secondarily, is that I think OG is wrong to say that these particular objective things are going to be complex. Insofar as I can tell you that men are the main reason why women are suffering, as opposed to just telling you that men are pigs, I think then the comparative here is that this passionate objectivity is likely to be just more focused on what is the actual message that I want to convey to you, absence of all of these emotional rhetorics that are going to drown out. Thirdly then, it is not just about data, the focal points just convey the truth. We think that data is going to be symmetric on both sides, however data is likely to be exploited with anger on Gulf bench. Next, why is it that people are likely to be receptive from outside? Number 1, because of safe space, you're more likely to feel welcome. Secondarily, objectivity requires you to understand the mental calculus of both individuals, and engaging in public discourse with objectivity encourages them to take the further step or try to understand. What is CEO's winning metric today? Number 1, in a world where we get more meaningful engagement. No, that is independent of people whether accept your views or not. Number 1, at least we get to lessen the barriers to engage on discourse. This answers the question on whether anger is the only key to unlock discourse of participation. It's already 6 for sure, I'll just take one.
Okay. Is the people on the ground more likely to care about the environment more in a world where you just say this is the statistics of the environment, the companies are fault, here's what we need to do? Or, okay, sure.
I think you need to understand, this is not a anger versus objectivity debate. They need to defend why is this the norm of anger, and we have already told you why each instances of a release of anger is going to exacerbate ones that overshadows all of the benefits that they want to accrue here. So here are the barriers of engagement discourse. Note that anger means that you get backlash and mudslinging. We think that anger from mental calculus looks like 2 things. Number 1, people are biologically averse to conflict. People are biologically averse to anger. It means when you meet anger, you're just going to want to step out of the discourse in itself. Secondarily, survival instincts. When people are met with anger, they're likely met with even a heightened form of anger to protect themselves. This means that you stifle meaningful progression of discourse. We think that this severely impacts also minorities in itself, where elites will now also use anger towards them and creates more infighting within the minorities. Next is that the increasing of anger leads to desensitization. This takes Gulf bench as their best case. Even if people buy in, your sustainability of anger inhibits because the brain now is more conditioned of this increasing exposure to anger. This means that people now normalize this anger and are unlikely to be as receptive to anger as what Gulf bench claims it to be. CG. Sorry, CO.
Now inviting Gak here.
Hello?
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Minorities will use anger regardless of the existence of the norm. The delta is whether we should embrace the anger of the people on the ground. We suggest that this norm is not about encouraging people to be angry, but rather to not dismiss the discussion by the people who are angry. When minorities want to talk about their issues, even when they have facts, people undermine them because the inherent association of minorities with irrationality by the majority privilege, like explained by Haikal. This norm opens the door for them to participate in the discussion because you're willing to listen to them even when they are angry under ours of the house. The CG extension that is explained by Haikal is simple. Not only do we counterbalance the discussion between minorities and majorities, we open the ability to participate and argue about their life and what their human experiences are. This can only happen at the point in which we actually reassure that this anger that they're feeling is justified, the anger that they're feeling, the human emotions that they're feeling are actually relevant. CO said that they will paint a bad picture of the minorities, but that will happen regardless because the majority perception on them of how they are irrational and how they are undermining them and their experiences, right? The first thing we're dealing with is with OO. The first observation is the problem with their counterfactual. They want to discuss anger in private and act like they're okay in public. This is directly contradictory with what they want to achieve because in the same breath, they say that these minorities should be open and about their problems with facts and be more rational when they are not angry with what they go through. The problem with this is that this team reduces human emotions to something insignificant. The reason why they are angry is because of the suffering that they had to face, the human experience that directly translates into what they feel. But why is this harmful then? Because number one, because of the feelings are justified because of what they go through. Because that is to say the grave injustice that they face in their day-to-day life, like the black people being killed just for the color of their skin, and the stereotype that they're tied down with criminals, or the innocent Palestinians actively being subjected to genocide. This team enables society to think that they're okay with what they're going through and it can be conveyed without the feeling of pain and suffering while confronting their oppressor. And they're boiling down the human emotions to something that does not matter. But secondly, when you wait for their anger to be suppressed, it kills the momentum of the movement. It actively makes people hopeless because they believe they have to suppress their emotions just because the people can't understand them from the majority race itself, right? But secondly, their main claim is that they want to buy in, get buy-in from people to support the movement. The reason why people don't want to buy in the movement isn't because of the anger that they portray, but because of the way that the privileged majority controls the narrative, which means that the root problem of all their anger of the minorities stems from the oppressors controlling the narrative itself. For example, every time a black person says Black Lives Matter, a white person literally says all lives matter because Hispanic people and Asian people are also statistically harmed as well, which means that they try to dismiss the sufferings and the sufferings of these facts with their And the only way they are spotlighted recently is because they portray the anger and the sufferings that they have through the BLM movement itself, right? So why exactly do people listen to anger? Firstly, because it visualizes how heavily affected these minorities are. For example, African Americans heavily voiced out their anger when Breonna Taylor or George Floyd died. It finally opened the eyes of the majority of individuals because previously they did not believe that this happened because they were suppressed and silenced of their anger by the majority of individuals. But secondly, it applies in a wide range of instances. For example, some demographics do not believe on data and statistics if they do not see it in front of their eyes, which means under our side, we claim that it is deeply embedded and it can universally applied at the point in which they see this and they portray the narrative of how exactly they are harmed. Right? I'll take a bit of an opening.
In a world where it is a norm and expected for every single black person, woman, and indigenous person to express their anger, who's listening?
So we explained to you that the delta here is that regardless of whatever circumstances, all majority or privileged individuals will view them as irrational and will view them as undermined. The problem with this is that it doesn't really take into account their feelings or emotions because they are immediately dismissed at the point in which they do not take into the anger into account, right? Under our side, we prove to you that you need anger or emotions to counterbalance the way in which you're doing discussions with these minorities. Your side of the house undermines them and says that they're irrational and that their human emotions are not worth it, right? Then we're dealing with CO because the only unique thing about CO is that they are emphasizing on the truth and the facts. Because the problem with OO was that their facts that they defend can be easily manipulated to the data and statistics that people from the majority race can actually paint them right. The problem with this is how exactly are they able to emphasize on the truth if the truth can be directly polarizing because number one, the power dynamics that exist between majority individuals and also minorities, which means the power dynamics can directly translate into them actually having a form of different forms of opinions and different forms of truth that come forth, which means at the point at which they are able to actually heavily be polarized, it means they aren't able to get the most truthful or most emphasized form of facts. This means the facts, the emphasis on the truth and that they want to defend is likely going to become not fruitful at the end of the day because there is going to be more emphasis on the majority of individuals' right. But secondly, they explain that this emphasis will uniquely be more meaningful forms of engagement and discussion. The problem with this is that you aren't able to get meaningful forms of discussion and engagement, and the point at which these minorities aren't able to engage meaningful with their oppressors because the point at which they are silenced about their voice and the silence about their anger by the majority race. They aren't able to actively be involved because they feel like they're actively being silenced and they're actively being harmed by their oppressors itself, right? Which means at the point at which you aren't able to actually meaningfully be engaged with your oppressor, it means you aren't able to actually have any form of fruitful discussion at the end of the day, right? Which means at the point at which they aren't able to prove that the emphasis on truth and facts can actually go through or actively counterbalance between what exactly the majority privileged people are actively painting them as, they aren't able to actually get that form of emphasis on truth because it is already proven in status quo that they cannot actively cross that boundary between the majority of individuals that paint them as the narrative that it is. And this is extremely important because at the point at which they aren't able to go through that power dynamics and become better than the other individual, like the white person, it means that they aren't able to actively be engaged at all in these meaningful discussions because there is a barrier of entry to how exactly they're going to enter in the first place, right? Then how we differentiate with OG. Because firstly, OG's alternative framing, we provide an alternative framing where this debate is not limited to social discourse, but it also encompasses the way in which politicians and public figures interact, which means we explain how it affects the bigger individuals or the bigger stakeholders in today's debate and how exactly politicians are interacting with one another. For example, how Trump and Kamala Harris are interacting with one another, right? And this means that we get bigger impact because we're able to prove to you that this affects the biggest stakeholders on the ground, right? But secondly, they never explain why exactly dispassionate objectivity came into place. We fill in the gaps and explain that it was dominated by the majority privileged individuals and why exactly minorities were suppressed in the first place and used this objectivity of facts to prove that they are undermined in the first place, right? With all those reasons, we prove to you, the conclusion here is that CG proves to you that they're able to actively outvoice whatever they're feeling without being antagonized by the narrative that they are controlled and dominated by the white people on the ground, right? The conclusion here is that we are able to actually get them to be entering discussions and not be shunned by the majority of individuals if this form of anger is empowered and their human emotions are actively seen as relevant, never important to propose.
It's good to wrap up the debate up with
Cobaan suara 1, 2, 3.
anger is impulsive, anger is sudden, anger is reactive, and anger is uncontrollable. You can't escape those things. People kill out of anger because they feel so. Anger is destruction. 3 things I want to do at the top of my speech. Firstly, I'm going to quickly weigh against closing government's one-liners. You see, he tells feminist movement use data now. Yeah, but you need to defend a world where feminist movement say, fuck you man, I'm the right person here. He says he don't remember seeing any Malay woman using statistics. I also don't remember any Malay woman being angry during protests. So one-liners really can't prove stuff. You need to weigh those things better. But to be really honest, CG has no extension. Let's just weigh directly. Their worst form of harm is you have fake statistics. It is unlikely for 3 reasons. 1, conducting fraudulent research is a crime. It is a punishable offense under most type of laws. 2, it is likely going to be peer reviewed. It is easily going to be called out. Educational experts and infrastructure are always going to do this. 3, it is in line with international organizations. So these things are published worldwide and globalized. It is unlikely to happen. Even if it is fake, probably they downplay the scale. The utility that Ern See posited to you still manifests. But under their model, when you use anger and people are able to weaponize against you in terms of the illicities, you're put into jail. You're being beaten with battered. You don't remedy the problem, but you exacerbate new forms of harm against minorities. Second thing, they claim you are silencing minorities and you force them to live with the kind of anger. 2 responses. 1, under your model, insofar as people continue to be angry, they will remain angry forever because there's no remedy to the solution. Under our model, Ern See's analysis proves to you why the participation and discourse is the tipping point for the majority or the people in the middle ground to join you to support your movement. Only when you support structure, make meaningful policy changes, get affirmative actions, are you able to remedy the problem, you stop them from suffering with the anger. 3 questions I'm going to answer this question, responses are being integrated. The first thing I want to talk, both teams talk about catharsis. Opening opposition response saying, but you can do this privately. Let's see how CEO hammers this home. 3 responses. 1, catharsis is only valuable and validated if the receiving party understands. Insofar you feel the other person doesn't understand, there's no value in catharsis. 2, catharsis is subjective. Every person perceives and feels catharsis in a very different way. Some feel bad for throwing stones against a police officer. Some may feel guilty after shaming the police officer who told them to move away. All these are very subjective, they really cannot be measured. But thirdly, even if people get catharsis under our model, we weigh against them for 3 reasons. 1, you're likely going to be served back with anger. This is a form of backlash. Elites has more money, control over media. They're able to control the rhetoric. Simple intuition pump. When I say Taliban, ISIS, the first thing comes to your mind is aggressive, violent, hostile. An average person doesn't even fucking know what they're fighting for. So the initial thought process as people feel about all this movement is that they're hostile, you don't want to listen. This inhibits all the meaningful projection, the truth in value that people want to get from their model because you inhibit them. Secondly then, authoritarian democratic states will use this as a justification to be used against you. Maybe they say they always do this, but notice the way in which you portray this as an anger allows them to justify to the democratic people. That's why the states are able to do so. Because it's a norm, everyone does it, they label you as a whole. Third thing then, this is clearly winning over the catharsis. Innocent people who do not use anger, who did not consent to be part of the movement, are also going to be labeled in the same way. They are also going to be discriminated. We are easily weighing against this because innocent people ought to be protected. You can't put them in harm's way. Second question, will people understand this? I have 5 responses to this. First, an average person can still assert certain non-abstract things. When I say school facilities are bad, when I say cost of living increase, when I say getting a job is very difficult, these are things that people don't need objective and data and statistics. The mere truth that is objective is sufficient to do so. We can also incorporate things like graphics and illustration, like how NAS daily does, serves as a form of motivation, impactful for people to try things. Secondly, criticism is Gav's criticism is how will people react positively? It's symmetrical. People react even more negative under your will. Thirdly, people will always challenge these ideologies for 3 reasons. 1, they're competing ideologies in things of religion, politics, and the social movement. 2, they also want to defend their own viewpoints. That's why you see in social media how people debate highly. All these things means, insofar as people say they can safely express their idea, only then they're meaningfully willing to engage. Third reason, you lock out people who are not angry because their prerequisite for anyone to participate in the argument is that you must be angry, you must be willing to be violent, only that you can be part of the movement. So people who don't feel I want to be violent, I want to go against the decision, they lock them out under their model. Lastly then, even if at their best case, everyone in the country is bodo, only there's some elitists and progressive people, the most important thing. Why is it very good? 3, 1, the elitists and most progressive people within the movement and the social movement, the Pandai ones, can still use the data and statistics, particularly for lobbying of things like political changes. 2,
the smart ones can still use this to find sponsorship because they're not labeled as antagonizing. They can use this form of advantage because corporations and NGO want to see track record and statistics. Why is this debate winning? One, you're able to benefit grassroots movement. Even if they don't understand the data and statistics, the top elites within that movement can use this to advantage. Do things like soup kitchen, support spaces, treatment centers for cognitive therapy and whatnot. All these are positive things to help people on the ground. Third question then, is objectivity and anger able to coexist? But before that, Haikal.
We explained to you as to why exactly humans are prone to objective truth. The problem here is that when people are angry, are you willing to accept their anger and their points of view? On your side of the house, you will say, no. On our side of the house, we are willing to listen to those people.
When it becomes a norm, the way people react has to be mechanized. Ern See give you 3 reasons why people automatically reject. But second, even if you buy them at the best, because your prefrontal cortex no longer perceives this to be a threat, there's no sense of urgency, you are conditioned to think it's no longer important. That's why people are no longer willing to engage in long term. This also weighs against our opening house, because they tell you things like, oh, sustainability is important, but they don't tell you what is the value of this. The fact that the social movement is very small, they start very small. They have to fight oppressive and preform structures. They can't overturn these kind of things in one night. LGBTQ feminist movements, even in the most progressive states like the US, they took decades to change. Only in a world where you're able to galvanize and allow people to participate meaningfully, you're able to find more people. It only occurs when the movement gains traction. The tipping point here to achieve success becomes the movement's ability to continue long term with less forms of resistance. This weighs us against them. But lastly then, why do we get better forms of movement and pre-structure? Because anger is impulsive and sudden, there's no cohesion between the club or the movement itself. Because when one person behaves badly, they get to label as a whole. Under our model, when people take objective steps, you're able to do things that are much more planned, organized and calculated. This is the best form in which any movement can move forward, because only then are they able to plan the achievements that they want to do so. Last thing then, can anger and objectivity coexist? Both OG and CG concede objectivity is important. If I prove anger as a preface inhibits the objective part, both of them are out. First impression of movement is a radicalism, the same Taliban and analysis. But number 2, over time people don't care about your objective, because the superseding ideology in everyone's mind, an average person, is that the anger part. Why is this true? 2 reasons. One, people don't really spend a lot of time going through this kind of stuff. So the first impression you make is lasting upon them. But secondly, the elites under their will use media, propaganda, all these controlling rhetorics to cement in people's mind that you're particularly bad. Even if you don't believe any of this, they need objectivity to win. CEO doesn't need.